Okay, we had a little bit of technical difficulties. So thank you for joining us just a few minutes late for North Dakota State Libraries Facebook Live. My name is Amanda Person, and I'm here to talk about a fossil expedition to James Ross Island in the Antarctic Peninsula that I took in 2003. Just to give you a little bit of background, I completed my master's degree in vert paleo in 2001, and I was working in a museum in Oklahoma when I was called upon to join this Antarctic expedition. My thesis was on a fossil bird found on Vega Island in the Antarctic Peninsula, and I was excited to experience the place I had studied so much about. So in November, which is the austral summer, I left Oklahoma and arrived in Santiago, Chile. We were whisked through customs by our guide from the US, backed Raytheon Polar Services, which is the company that the National Science Foundation used at the time for their polar expeditions. We caught a flight from Santiago, Chile to Punta, Chile, and were home for a few days while we organized and repacked our field gear and were outfitted for our expedition. We are down in the very southern portion of Chile, down at the Straits of Magellan, and this is a statue in the town square of Magellan. And if you can see, it's good luck if you are going out to sea to rub the foot of the little guy kind of sitting in the middle there. His toe is really, really shiny. So we, of course, did all of that before we left. So then we spent several days in Punta Arenas, and here we are in a local warehouse that we repacked all of our food into these wooden rock boxes for transport to keep everything safe during the passage. And we left all the excess packaging in the port because everything we bring with us, we have to take back. And the understanding is we eat all the food from these boxes and then fill those boxes up with fossils on the way back. This is Jen Hargrave, my tent mate and friend. We had to practice setting up our Scott tent in the warehouse to make sure that when we're on the island, we know what we're doing. The design of the Scott tent hasn't changed since the early polar explorers used the same double-walled sort of cross between an umbrella and a teepee. This rope harness that Jen is working on here is called a burley bridle, and we use that to belay the tent up. And then the bottom of the canvas is waterproof, so that then we pile snow on the bottom, and then it won't melt and get the tent wet. So success, we did it. This tent is about 10 feet tall, and the ropes on the side are used to sort of guide the tent out, adding to the stability and making sure, in theory, that it doesn't blow down in high winds. None of our tents blew down, but the winds get pretty tough on the peninsula. So here's our ship, the Lawrence M. Gould. It's an icebreaker used by researchers from the United States National Science Foundation for research in the Southern Ocean. This vessel is named after Lawrence McKinley Gould, an American scientist that explored both the Arctic and Antarctic, and he was second in command of Admiral Richard Byrd's first expedition to Antarctica, beginning in 1929. And he also set up an American exploration base on the Ross Ice Shelf. This icebreaker has no keel, and it just pretty much rams itself through the ice. And here are my fellow scientists, the ones that are coming with me on this expedition. There were a lot of other scientists on board. There were geologists, there were marine biologists, botanists, all sorts of people doing all sorts of things all over the Antarctic Peninsula. This ship was used by the National Science Foundation, and so every time they went out, there was as many expeditions on there as they could sort of fit. So here we are, November 25th, in the Drake Passage, which is the body of water between South America's Cape Horn and the South Shetland Islands of the Antarctic Peninsula. There is no significant landmass anywhere around the world at the latitudes of the Drake Passage, which is important for the unimpeded flow of the Antarctic circumpolar current, but also has some of the worst seas on the planet. This was our first day in the Drake Passage, and it was actually a pretty nice day. We were in the passage for several days, and I remember sitting in the galley, looking at the porthole and seeing all sky, and then all sea, and then all sky, and it was quite rough. 2 days later, on the 27th of November, this is our first iceberg. We actually at 1 a.m. hit some sea ice. It was very loud because our room was below the water level of the ship. It was really loud. I'd never heard an ice hitting a ship before, but I knew exactly what it was when we heard it. Very distinct sound. So here we are. This map is really far away, but this is where we're heading, to the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's tough when you're talking about Antarctica because pretty much everything is north because you're almost at the southern pole. So you sort of have to pick a north. And in this instance, when we're on the peninsula, north is as close as you can get to South America. So this is where we were heading. We had to drop some people off in different places, but we were not on the continent, we were on the peninsula. So a close-up of where we're going. We had several different stops. We're headed to Vega Island, which is on the top right of the screen. We ended up on James Ross Island, which is right below Vega Island. We spent some time on King George Island, which is on the western side of the peninsula in that yellow box over there. So one of our stops was Frey Base, which is a Chilean and Russian base on King George Island. We had to stop here to pick up some scientists and to drop off equipment and supplies, which is pretty much the tune of our icebreaker adventure. This polar base here is located on the western side of the island, shared by the Chileans and the Russians. Apparently at the time they didn't much get along. I'm sure things have changed in the preceding 14 years. Here is the Zodiac operations. There was a large crane on the ship, and you have to load the Zodiac, use the crane to get it into the water, and then load the people onto the Zodiac. The gentleman who was about to step into the Zodiac was our friend Wade, who was being offloaded and sent home because he had a very high fever, and you can't be put on in the Antarctica without, if you have a fever, nobody can get you out. It was just the flu. He ended up being pretty much okay, but better safe than sorry. We were sorry to see him go though. Here we are the next day. We encountered our first pack ice, which is ice that is covering the water. There's a tabular iceberg, of course, there in the background. There I am, much younger, with a lovely iceberg. Also notice all of the ice crusting on the ship. They had a lot of sailors. That was their job, to sort of tink, 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 like knock all the ice off at all times, or the ship would get too heavy. Here's a very large tabular iceberg that we saw. It took us quite a few minutes to get past it. And it had just broken off a larger ice shelf. And here's an iceberg that had been melting, but in the past had been utilized by polar animals, most likely penguins. You can sort of see the path that it took, the sort of darker little trail there on the top. And we got as close as we could because it's very hard to take a bad picture in Antarctica. It's so beautiful. And here we are with some penguins in the foreground on some pack ice and large tabular icebergs in the background, an island there. And we were in a small bay doing some surveys for the oceanographers were taking some plankton samples. So here's a page from my field book with the partial map of the Antarctic Peninsula. So you can note the location of Palmer Station, the American base on Anvers Island. And we actually stopped there to drop off supplies and pick up scientists. And our intended destination is on Vega Island, which is on the right-hand side of the Antarctic Peninsula. Here we are at Palmer Station, picking up scientists, dropping off equipment, food supplies, and the mail. We were very popular because they hadn't had mail for many weeks. Palmer Station is an American year-round research station situated on the southern end of Anvers Island. It was opened in 1965 and has operated continuously as the main U.S. Center for Antarctic Biological Research. We spent a day at Palmer Station and took a Zodiac trip to a nearby Torgerson Island and saw lots of wildlife like this Weddell seal and lots of Adelie penguins that were nesting at the time of our visit. They had just laid their eggs, so we didn't see any fluffy baby penguins, but we got to see lots of cool penguins and their nests and their eggs. The penguin, this particular type of penguin, the Adelie penguin, is common along the entire Antarctic coast, which is the only place that they live in the world. Here they are making their nests of rock piles. Didn't seem very comfortable, but they seemed to be happy with that. They were on any spot of open rock, so they didn't move rocks onto the snow. They looked for any spot that did not have snow, and they built little piles of rocks. Here's a close-up of an especially curious penguin. They were very, very curious. They kept coming to check us out if they didn't have an egg on their feet. The small ice in this bay on the left-hand side of your screen, it made like this constant white noise of the ice, little tiny icebergs like rubbing against each other with the waves. So it was this constant background noise. And here are the penguins doing their nest building. The male penguins would offer a stone to the female, and she would either accept it and place it on the nest, or she would toss it out. It was pretty funny. They kept trying the same rocks over and over again. Here's a close-up of a penguin. One of them's laying on his egg, and the other one has his egg on his feet, cooling the egg, but also protecting it from the rock. So as we were leaving, encountered this leopard seal who was obviously looking for a penguin lunch. All the penguins got out of the water really fast. So we're back on the icebreaker and we're traveling around the Antarctic Peninsula. And you can see we're looking back. I'm at the end of the ship, and that's our path through the pack ice. So now I'm at the front of the ship, and Vega Island, our intended destination, is in the background. You can see the pack ice is all the way up to the shoreline, and we needed open water to travel from the icebreaker via the Zodiac to the shore. So we kept trying to get to Vega Island in different places around the whole island. And here's a map of our destination. We're trying to get to Cape Lamb, Vega Island, and to the south, you can see the very large James Ross Island, and that ended up being where we had to put in because we were unable to get onto shore. We got stuck on the ice trying to get around Vega Island. It was kind of tricky, but you know, the captain, this has happened before. You can kind of see here in the foreground the ship, the edge of the ship there, but also there was an iceberg that got trapped in the sea ice. So when that happens, the iceberg's constantly moving, the sea ice gets thicker and thicker around the iceberg, and the second mate who was driving at the time got too close to one of those, and we kind of got ramped up and stuck on the ice. Here we are, you can see our path in the background, and there's another iceberg that had gotten caught in the sea ice there. We had several hours stuck with the engines sort of revving, and then the captain moved the on-ship crane that is usually used to get the Zodiacs into the water, moved it back and forth a bunch and sort of like rocked us free, and then we continued on through the pack ice, and the captain did not go back to sleep. He continued to drive the ship after that. So this is Vega Island, and you can see just south there is a small peninsula of James Ross Island sort of sticking up there. In Antarctic exploration, it's important to be flexible. So we were unable to get to Vega Island because the pack ice was all the way up to the shore, and so we went south to what is called the Naze on James Ross Island, which is close to Vega. We know there's fossils on Vega Island. There had never been a fossil expedition to James Ross Island. So no matter what, we were going to either say, yes, there were fossils, important, no, there weren't, also important. So after 12 days on the icebreaker, we put in on James Ross Island, our new home, for the next 20 days. So although this wasn't our original destination, we could do important work here, looking at the geology, the paleontology, and anything that we could learn would be important. So here is Jen and I'm on the right, Jen's on the left, in our float coats, which is like a gigantic life preserver, but also a coat, waiting on the icebreaker for our turn to get on the Zodiac and go ashore to start setting up camp. So here's our view from the campsite. We're looking toward the shore here with the landing party, getting ready to unload another Zodiac. So the tire tracks that you can see are from our four-wheeler that we use to help with the unloading. And It stayed on the island with us, but we only used it in emergencies, which we luckily had no emergencies, so we never had to use it. As part of the International Antarctic Treaty, there's limited use of mechanized vehicles in Antarctica to preserve the land. Antarctica is mostly treated like the world's national park, and there should only be scientific exploration, not oil and gas exploration, and also scientific bases, not military bases. All countries have signed this Antarctic Treaty. Not all countries adhere to the letter of that treaty, though. So I'm standing in the same place as the last photograph. I just turned around. So here is our camp. You can note the white sort of upside down U-shaped weather haven tent to the left of your screen. That's our cook tent. And our yellow Scott tents, which are all set up. You can see the four-wheeler there in the middle. And then our green bathroom tent. Anybody wanting details of that procedure can email me. I'll elaborate how you take care of a month's worth of 15 people's wastes. Needless to say, it all comes back with us on the icebreaker. There's an incinerator. It's a whole process. We can talk about that later. Here's me with Hearst Bay in the background. This is our first hike around the island. We had not been on there, had not planned to be on this island. So we were just sort of getting the lay of the land and assessing where the best place would be to prospect for fossils. So we just were tourists this first day. Here's just a beautiful glacially impacted landscape. We're hiking to a place that had been mapped by the British Antarctic Survey. They essentially flew over all these small islands and just did a basic geologic, literally leaning out of the airplane, saw a lake, called it Hideaway Lake. Nobody was really on the ground. Here is another U-shaped glacial valley. So when the glacier comes through, it makes a very distinctive U-shaped valley. The glacier has since retreated, and then leaving this very distinctive geological feature in its place. Here I am at Hideaway Lake. Lots of large rocks. The lake was being held back by a glacier. So where I am would be the bottom of the lake, but it had since drained. So luckily, we were only there for a day. It was not a good place to look for fossils, so we did not return. But we were all hoping that the glacial dam did not break while we were at the base of this essentially empty lake bed. So here is our map again, Vega Island, and down very at the bottom of your screen, you can see the yellow asterisk is where our camp was there on Hearst Bay. And then the yellow square at the very tip of the peninsula is Dagger Peak and Comb Ridge, where we ended up doing a lot of our prospecting. So this is on the shoreline during our hike with the distinctive Humps Island in the background. So on the left of your screen, there's sort of a double humped island. We actually spent a little time there on the last day when the icebreaker came. We did walk around Humps Island, and our camp is on the shore very far away. We're a couple miles away from where this photo was taken. There's an extreme high and extreme low tide when we were there, and the pack ice was very close up to the shoreline. At this point, luckily, there was open water where our camp was. So there are no land mammals that live in Antarctica. Polar bears are exclusively an Arctic species. Everybody wanted to know if I saw any polar bears. Nope, wrong pole. We did, however, see a large gull called a skua, and this is one of their nests with 2 eggs. These birds have been known to be quite aggressive. They had stolen people's hats, would dive bomb groups of people, so we didn't linger around this nest. And we only saw a few skuas flying around, and we left them alone, and they left us alone too. If you're watching this live, this photo was actually taken 14 years ago today, coincidentally. It was my birthday when we were on the island, and my fellow scientists walked ahead and wrote, "Happy birthday, Amanda," on the sand. So it was my birthday card for my 28th birthday. So this photo was taken around midnight of my birthday, but don't read too much into that. Note the silhouette of Humps Island in the background and the rounded Weather Haven tent a little bit in the foreground on the left of your screen. This is as dark as it ever got all night. So keeping in mind, we were on the island during the austral summer and over the austral summer solstice. This is the point at which the sun reaches its highest position in the sky as seen from the South Pole. So if we were stationed at the South Pole, it would be much brighter than this all night. But as we were still many hundreds of miles away, it never got much darker than what I would consider twilight. So here's a view of our hike. Every day we hiked from camp to Dagger Peak and Comb Ridge along the curve of Hurst Bay. We called this our daily commute. It was about 3 miles. And we were walking on the toe of a glacier. It was beautiful. It was rugged. It was a lot of hard work. So here we are prospecting for fossils on Fortress Hill, looking back along the way that we had came. So camp is in the background, many miles away. And you can see in this area, there's not a lot of snow cover. Obviously, if there's snow cover, we can't find fossils. So we did a lot of prospecting. The landscape, which was very beautiful, but it was unusual because there was no vegetation. So there was no trees, there were no shrubs, there were no cactus, there was nothing. And the fact that there was no snow here was excellent for us because we could look for fossils, and we actually found quite a few. So this is a fossil ammonite, which is an invertebrate that is similar to today's living nautilus, and it's a shell. We, of course, here are some more. We're not particularly looking for these invertebrates, but they can be important in determining the age of the sediments in which we were working. This particular type of ammonite was good for us because the timing was correct to find, hopefully, some vertebrates. And here we are prospecting on Dagger Peak. If we had climbed to the top and looked over this peak, we could see Vega Island across the sound. So we're at the very tip of that peninsula on James Ross Island. We had this collapsible sieve that we would each of us take apart and hike the 3 miles here, and we used it to sort sediment at the site of a partial dinosaur that we found while we were prospecting. Vega Island is sort of in the distance in the middle of the very background. And this was actually a really great thing that one of our fellow scientists devised and came up with and had shipped over. It was very heavy, but we used it to drive sieve and actually found quite a lot. So here's a sort of an overview photo of some of the dinosaur fossils that we found at the site. Lots of fragments, but again, some of them are very small, and we would have never found them if we didn't have that sieve with us. Here's a close-up of some foot elements of a small theropod dinosaur that we found there, and the scale bar is there to give you some sense of the size of these bones. So our first snow day, we were on the island for 8 days. We stayed in camp since there's no way to prospect when everything is covered with snow. And we took sort of what passes for a shower, which utilized a camp stove to heat water. And even though you're really cold, boiling water, it's still really hot. So it took a little bit of practice to get the temperature correct. But there's not much else to do. Here we are inside the Weather Haven tent. Not much else to do on a snow day but hang out together in the cook tent and play cards and think about lunch. By the next day, the snow had mostly blown away and we were back to prospecting on Comb Ridge, but the snow did start again in the afternoon. So we had a good most of the day prospecting, and then we headed home because we had some whiteout conditions. They mostly cleared up on our way back, but it was a little bit scary to think, we had to walk 3 miles in that. But we all survived it. Here is a really cool photo. You can see Humps Island in the background, so we're pretty close to camp. And this is a photo of katabatic winds coming off the glacier. So a katabatic wind is a gravity-driven wind. So the glacier up tall is very, very cold. Where we were was cold, but not as cold as where the glacier was. And so these huge, quick winds would come through. And you can see this red-coated figure of one of my fellow researchers just getting hit with the winds. Actually, I think she had stopped to take a photo and then started moving again really quick. So here are a few more pictures of the fossils that we found while dry screening and prospecting. We found mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, both of which are not dinosaurs. They're marine reptiles, and we had expected them, but it was interesting to find the terrestrial species of the dinosaur, along with these marine species as well. We did have a couple snow days. I think it snowed 4 days out of the 20 that we were on the island. But this is our little camp in the snow. And most days were like this. Beautiful blue sky, temperatures above zero. I wouldn't call it warm, but when you're walking 3 miles to work every day, it's pretty warm. We were really quite lucky with the weather. And again, it was beautiful. It was impossible to take a bad photo. We did walk out to the glacier. This is the toe of the glacier on James Ross Island. That was just south of our camp. And one of the few mammals that we saw on the island was this Weddell seal. He was taking a nap. I was using my zoom lens. I did not get that close because he was huge. When we started taking pictures, he was sleeping, and then as you see, his head is sort of lifted up. He began to wake up, and we kept walking because they're pretty intimidating. This is the hill behind our camp. You could maybe see it in some of the other photos. It was just beautiful blue sky, beautiful snow, another beautiful day. And here I am inside my Scott tent looking out. And this was the view that we woke up to every morning. We didn't see a lot of penguins until one of the last days that we were on the islands. These Adelie penguins came to visit our camp. They're very, very curious. Penguins in general apparently would walk miles if they saw a researcher in the snow just to see what's going on. So they came to check us out. So there's good old Humps Island in the background. This is our last day, December 24th, 2003. We were on the island for 20 days. We had 4 snow days and 1 shower. So we were all happy to get back on the icebreaker. We had to take short showers on the icebreaker, except the rule is when you come on board right after you had been on the island, you could take as long of a shower as you want. So here's a map of the icebreaker's travel. After we were dropped off, the ship sailed a grid for the biologists on board that were taking plankton samples. You can see in the upper right of the map where it's sort of like, they just went up and down and up and down. They just were doing all sorts of different research while we were doing our research on the island. And here's a lovely picture, Christmas Day. We were just beginning our trip back. We were at the beginning of the Antarctic Sound, heading home. And the packed ice was freshly covered with snow, and the bright blue sky was amazing. There was no pollution. We actually didn't see a lot of penguins or any sort of animals. It was just beautiful. It was really hard to stay out on board the ship and look out at it because it was just so bright. And there I am with the first mate. I'm actually steering the ship. Sounds impressive, but we were in the open ocean. There were no icebergs around. I wasn't worried. It wasn't a lot of hard work, but it was fun. And this is one of the last icebergs that we saw on this voyage. You can sort of see the underwater portion of it. We had to, of course, steer clear of that, but this is a very cool photo that you could see so much of. Everybody says, oh, 90% of the iceberg is underwater. Well, actually, you can see that in this photo, and it's pretty cool. And here is a beautiful Antarctic sunset. We arrived home after a day of flights back on December 31st. So it was quite a long trip. And this is my contact information. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me at any time. And this is a picture of some of our books at the State Library on Antarctica. So you should visit your local library or the State Library for books on Antarctica. The books will be filled with adventure and discovery, natural beauty, and also a lot of hard work because Antarctica is a very difficult place to do any sort of research. Thank you for tuning in.